Let's take a look at a couple of the action attributes. We'll look at ignore, which allows you to skip a test. I mean, you're leaving the test in your test class, but you're going to be able to skip it. And that means you can just come back to it later and then include it back just by eliminating this ignore attribute. Another one is a timeout attribute, which is timed out in milliseconds, and it basically just says how long you want to wait for a test to complete. Maybe you're trying to connect to a database. If that database isn't there, let's go ahead and only wait a certain amount of time before we fail on that. So it fails if it's not completed within the interval specified in the timeout attribute. All right, let's take a look at the ignore attribute and the timeout attribute. In the file process test, find the file name does exist and add the ignore attribute. Go ahead and run all tests. And let's go ahead and set our grouping back to project, namespace, and class. And now what you'll see is that little caution sign again, just like we saw before, when it tells us that, hey, we've skipped this for some reason, or it was inconclusive. In this case, it's simply an ignore. And then you can just, comment that out when you're ready to put that test back in. And there you go. So an ignore attribute. The other one I mentioned is a timeout. So I'm going to take a look at this here. We add a new test method called simulate timeout. And all I'm doing is adding a test method, setting a timeout to 3000. And inside of this simulate timeout, I'm doing a system.threading.thread.sleep for 4000 milliseconds. So that's going to take 4 seconds, but the timeout says it needs to respond within 3. If we now run this test, you can see that it does indeed time out, tells you the duration there. If we click on it, you can see that that method name, simulate timeout, exceeded the execution timeout period.